Okay, so I re-listened to my ramble. I deleted it because I thought I I could tell that I was just talking in circles and I wasn't quite explaining actually what I was trying to get to, and that's why I even titled it with like a ramble and whatnot. There were some little points that I made, but I could see, so I had this in mind, what I was envisioning, and I could feel what I was trying to say, but I just hadn't quite said it. I think that's why sometimes it is useful to connect with other people that kind of follow the reasoning, and they can kind of help you work through the blind spots or the questions that help try to suss out what you're attempting to say, because some of these ideas are difficult to like provide some kind of imagery of. I am finding that when doing some of these like system comparisons and theory exchanges, it, in terms of communicating it or developing an imagery, telling stories is helpful. It's just working through the language or communicating these stages of things, because the human network, there's a lot of stuff where we simply just don't know how to experience or imagine other people's experience, and so we generalize and make assumptions, and so we're trying to do this trade of ideas, right? So that's what I was trying to do. I thought I didn't really produce enough useful content to keep that. It was just kind of a long circular argument. But anyway, so let me try it on this way. There's a lot of, I have to explain stuff that it's already in my memory bank and file, but I don't unpack it, or I forget to tell people what I'm imagining. And so they can say, oh, do you mean like this? Or do you mean, this way or that way? So to introduce a few portions of imagery or theories, in terms of the way that I tend to, at this stage of my life, look at religion and tend to think that there is the ability to see what is kind of like the universal aspect of things. I say that because, like I said, I've been following and involved in interaction and just absorbing a lot of content within the atheistic form of belief, and along those lines involves the suggestion that certain beliefs, there's no way to connect them, right? That's the assumption. And then within the Christian version of things, that's where you get into this whole competing as there's only one way to God, and that assumes that all of these are other forms competing against God. And maybe in some ways we could say that's what it seems like, but I think I'm trying to introduce a different way of looking at it, as though it's not always so much that, because ultimately in the grand scheme of things, once there's the reveal of what life is, there wouldn't be a other God. So in actual reality, there is just one God. If it turns out that there's just one God, there's always just been one God. And so then the question is, why does it seem like, what practices are producing this notion that there's these other gods and other interpretations? What's the behavioral dynamic that's going on there? I think that's what I was trying to get to saying, and I wasn't unpacking the imagery of all these different ways that I was like kind of looking at it or attempting to try to explain it. And so I think just introducing that notion, approaching religion in the world network, is that there either is just this one God, and among that one God, we should be able to find a shared aspect of the universal nucleus, and the image by which we're made in, the parameters by which we're created in. We should be able to find that at some level functioning through every group, because along those lines. So then, okay, so hold that thought, bookmark that. I think this is what is, I think, part of what I've been trying to say and articulate, and it also coincides with some of the approach I was trying to take with the debates with Sam Harris. And so what's also involved in this, and an area that I do find a usefulness in some of the approach that the atheists take, because they follow along with looking at the study of other aspects of nature, the components we find ourselves in, and in terms of evolutionary theory, right? And so then I have to introduce that idea as I'm influenced by that approach. So I didn't say that before. It was already just in the backdrop of my mind, and so I think that's where I was not quite delivering or communicating all of the factors that I'm imagining, the components that I'm imagining when I'm trying to formulate this idea to communicate it. So another component is that I tend to agree with the stage of some portions of the evolutionary theory as an effect within these parameters, right? So if we're trying to figure out what is the nucleus of things functioning that starts at the very core of creation and the way we're created and the other dynamics we find ourselves in, and then from that everything is expanded out from there. And there's all these different degrees of stages of development in the complexities of the basic origins of your human experience to a complex system. And so along those lines, then also prior, when looking at the moral landscape, the way that I assessed some of it, and I'm just kind of going off memory now, to really talk about this, I should probably go review my notes and, skim through the book again and whatnot. But I think this is a different approach than a lot of religious arguments, because a lot of times religious arguments try to make that leap of just creation, and they try to set it up in competition or opposing evolution. Some will try to introduce a type of God guiding evolution, and I'm somewhat familiar with that portion of the debate as well, because then people will say, well, there's a lot of horrific things though that had developed within evolutionary theory, and there needs to be eventually there's corrective measures imposed upon it, and so how could that be an effect of a perfect loving God, right? So then other theologians will address that portion of things, and they'll say, well, that's the cosmic battle, that's like the demon in the system that produces or distorts the otherwise like perfect image of the creation that God would develop and whatnot. I'd have to get to that too, and so maybe that's why I was having a hard time, because I was holding all these different ideas in my mind and thinking, how do I explain this? So I just, as I was re-listening to it, I'm like, man, that was really circular, that really was a ramble, and so I thought I need to break down the pieces that are in the backdrop of my mind when I'm thinking of systems. And so just from memory, without getting my notes out, because I'm just covering a lot of ground lately, and so I'm just feeling like trying to talk through it. From memory, some of the study of the moral landscape, from what I recall, is that one of the things that it seems like Sam Harris is trying to debunk, because at that point in time he had already debated a lot of religious groups and whatnot, and it was this kind of creation, God creating mankind and whatnot, and then from there all these other components, and it just didn't seem to quite account for other factors in trying to solve the basic human condition that we find ourselves in, the portions of existence, and then how it solves for getting to the other portions. So if it was, say, like an equation, it just didn't quite seem to fit. It didn't solve for all of the things, even though there were some portions, if you just set it aside, and then later on there were some good portions. It's kind of like when you're putting a puzzle together and you have some portions where it's not all lost. There's obviously some gains, but it's not quite lining up with other portions. And so I think this is actually, maybe what I'm trying to articulate, like among identifying where some of that stuff might be in conflict with religion, because it seemed approached in the debates as perpetual conflict. It seems like this is the approach Sam Harris is taking to like unearth their argument, or destabilize it, or pull it down from what seemed to be an argument that's kind of built without a base, I guess. And so what we're looking at here is the argument for the base. If we're looking at the system, how it develops from that creation point. Of course, I'm not gonna, I'm not like a specialist in evolutionary theory. I'm just supposing, right? And so, what it seems like. So what really helped it kind of kick into gear when I was doing studies for the moral landscape was I was introduced to, so somebody had given me some books and whatnot, and I think they were imagining that I would enter into this argument, and so they gave me some books that had the side of the evolutionary opposition to science and morality and creation and whatnot. I didn't read all the book, I just like skimmed through it. But the portion that caught my eye was this argument that they were trying to make, and they were trying to debunk the evolutionary approach, and they had the argument of the I, and they were saying how the I is just way too complex, that there has to be a creator, that the I couldn't have evolved from just the basic building block, like the basic, like from nothing unto the complexities of the I. And when I was reading that and I was thinking, I'm not sure, I'm kind of getting, kind of interested in some of these other, like something seems correct about some portions of evolution. And so I kind of stumbled upon, I just took that portion of that book. And instead of kind of reading the rest of the argument that was using it to oppose and saying that there's no way things could evolve from very simple to a complex system, in terms of like the I, there had to be a creator. There has to be like the creator that just created the I created us in this image, right, of how we see our bodies and whatnot. So instead, I at the time was already kind of taking a different approach, and so I looked it up online, and then that's when I stumbled upon that video that I had shared a while back of Richard Dawkins way back in the day doing his evolutionary approach teaching and whatnot. And he was doing this because I guess he's long since been arguing with different religious debates and whatnot. He was doing, and he actually approached this very well. I enjoyed this teaching, and I found it very useful. He introduced his argument as to why the I can develop from, like the basic, like the small incremental stages of development into a complex unit of the I. And so when he was introducing this, then he also was introducing how other creatures kind of like formulate those stages of development from very simple, minuscule to then complex, and how so I think this is what will help me kind of introduce what I was trying to say, is that I think this is a useful argument for not like against religion, but to better understand what's happening with religion. And so what the argument seems to or how I kind of draw out some influence in terms of looking at it through the lens of religion and systems and development, is that it seems to actually prove that everything has a start at the base, and even prior to that. And so that's where the argument of the consciousness, the invisible, and then whatever it is that produces the initiating stage of beginning what we perceive or experience as the physical. I say perceive because, they have these studies where everything actually breaks down. Like everything can be broken down into like small atoms or whatnot. And there's suggestions of it eventually being maybe like string theory or other things in between. So there's like consciousness, and then whatever that the next stage of energy is, and then the next stage of energy, and then the stages of like what we perceive as like these like full physical manifestation. But it's still all very much like pieces of energy, right? But anyway, so like the invisible to the physical, at that stage when it starts pulling together components, it starts at a very minuscule stage, but it doesn't seem to produce from that point further levels of development without other outside forces. And so the shared forces then take it from that basic point into like another stage of incremental development, and then another stage of incremental development, but not on its own, not in isolation. There's other factors and forces that are participating in that formation. And so therefore everything that is developed within those interactions, within those parameters. The effect of the relationship or what have you, developing its, now I'm getting circular again with my language, like formulating the outcomes of it, right? And what this also, so another imagery to follow what I'm talking about is kind of likened to I think it's like Fibonacci sequence, the Fibonacci sequence. The Fibonacci sequence is another example where we get imagery where this complex, like expanding out imagery of development, they found in some things has this certain pattern where when you break it down, you see it breaks down into similar versions of the pattern out from which it expanded. And so there's a pattern that goes all the way back and drops into a very certain starting point. From that starting point is this certain pattern that simply repeats out, and then it repeats farther out, and then it repeats farther out and farther out until it you see this pattern in nature. So people will talk about, I think I'm getting it right, the Fibonacci sequence, where that minuscule portion, the initiation, expands out, and it's just this repetitive pattern, right? So this is kind of what I was trying to say, is that the effects, all of the different, whether it be like physics and other interactions, the chemistry or what have you, whatever the different components are, in and of themselves create how it expands out. So everything should be able to kind of be mapped out onto accounting for all of these portions. So all of these portions account for this interaction that is the outcome. And so along with that, then the dynamics that it creates in are conditions that preserve, they are in some ways by definition that which is some level of adapted livability. What am I trying to say there now? So I am challenging myself. I'm trying to figure out how to put these pieces together. So what I mean by that is there's these other stories where groups say it could be that in other like dimensions or farther out beyond this universe and other universe, that there are like developed forms of existence that, because they've developed and evolved within these other conditions and forces, they are able to take, for instance, like if somebody said, could there be, and I think this is actually an example that they use in this piece of this like book or whatever, and it was one that I just kind of skimmed as well, so I don't know the whole argument, but it was something to the effect of, it could be that out there somewhere there's certain conditions that allow for certain creatures to be able to live from like breathing lava or something. They breathe lava, but it wouldn't happen like in isolation, so everything around it would be an effect that has allowed it to do that. And so it'd be a whole different system that has like developed to allow all these factors to function together to produce that outcome, or those like interconnected like outcomes. Therefore, when you're looking at some of these things, when you're zeroing in on one portion and you're looking at it, everything is a system. Everything experiences through some type of interplay of a system at a smaller level and at a larger level. And so none of those aspects really develop on their own. And like for the most part, in the like if we're not if we're looking at like the physicality of what in practice is being manifest, not like some offshoot of like just the delusion of something or whatever. But for the most part, even the delusion usually is out from an effect, though, still. But anyway, let's not go there. So therefore, then what I'm also trying to say is, so because of that, because you can kind of look at a condition and you can look at if there's this system, one portion of the system, say for instance, like Dawkins will say, well, even like a gnat is like a complex little machine. And it is. When you look at it, it has all these certain, it's incredible to look at it as like such a small, minuscule machine, functioning machine, like little bugs and stuff. And there's reasons and conditions at their scale as to why they are like they are. And so they're not just like, so they're a part of a map. They in themselves are a little system map that can tell you about what's on the outside of it, what's on the inside of it, what's on the outside of it. You can gauge, you should be able to gauge the physics of what it exists within, what caused it to exist in that way, and what's the interplay of what it exists among, right? And so because of those things, like we're going down the rabbit hole here. Because of those things, this is why some like biologists and whatnot, when they're studying nature, like Dawkins and some of his work. So some of his work I really do like. And I feel like he's come around over all these years. And so anyway, because of this, once people start learning these patterns and seeing it, they can look at a species and they can make a hypothesis or like, an educated guess as to, okay, because this creature does this, that suggests there must be this counterpart of other things affecting it, right? And so they study things like camouflage or other behaviors, and that behaviors don't happen in isolation. They're in response to other things on the outside going on. For instance, there was this, and I forget the exact reference of it. It's some kind of moth. I think it's like in South America somewhere. Or wait, was it like, I forget. Anyway, so there was this like moth, and it had this strange, I think it was like some kind of strange, kind of really long straw that kind of like flowed out, hovered out or something. And they were trying to figure out why is it like that? And so certain ones that were starting to study, these approaches and evolution and whatnot, and this adaptation, they're like, because of this, there must be this, according to our theory, there must then be some type of flower that is a part of its like how it's adapted, how it's evolved. There must be some kind of flower that's adapted for, because they're starting at this point to look through the lens of everything develops in incremental increase unto some type of interrelationship. And so what they're finding is every time you see something in a system, one part of the system, you can gauge that its behavior is the result of some type of relationship, and not always relationship like a positive relationship, some type of survival or some kind of imposed interaction, right? It could be a survival relationship, a symbiotic relationship, things like that. It could be a survival imposing, but you should be able to look at a creature or something and then map out the outside forces or influences of what gives it life, what's shaped its being, why it does the things it does, and its behavior. I think this was what I was trying to explain eventually in looking at religion and human behavior and whatnot. Generally, like just in general. Eventually, because he was looking at this, I think it was like, was it like a moth or was it like a bird or something? Anyway, so so they couldn't find it, and so he was feeling like his theory or something was, like collapsing. And he's like, no, it just seemed like other, anyway. So eventually, though, he does find the flower. He eventually finds this certain flower, and he's like, yes, I knew it. And then he finds that function is used for those certain types of flowers. And anyway, so these are some of the things that I'm thinking of when I started to go down this rabbit hole. This is what also influenced me to start developing systems theory in this other way, because I started to realize everything seems to have like this certain kind of like wave of interaction or something that kind of shifts around and evolves in forms and morphs and stuff. Like another example to provide an imagery is when I was little, like I've shared this story before, when I was little, I remember just kind of my theory side probably coming out when I was sitting there and I was watching the TV, like those old TVs where you see the static and on the TV. It wasn't all staticky. It was actually just those old TVs where when you get close to it, it's just little dots. And then when you're so close to it, it's a picture when you like step farther back and you see the image, but when you look at it really close, it's all these dots, right? And I remember having this thought when I was little, and I remember thinking, like, what if everything's like that? What if, this is TV, but what if everything is like that? What if everything around us is like this floating collection of dots, like that art pointillism? Everything's like these little dots, and it's all just this whole wave of dots. I don't know why I was thinking that as a kid, but so I remember thinking, like, what if it's just like all one wave and it's all little dots? Everything breaks down to these little dots, and all these dots like formulate and like connect, and then that's how we like experience what we see, and like how, whatever. I guess later in life, learning about, like molecules, particles, things like that, I'm like, okay, that's kind of interesting, like atoms. And then there's all this like vibration in between these certain components and whatnot. But anyway, so you have to understand that's kind of what's in my file of thinking about this too, is like this inescapable, just like wave of everything, right? Or like blanket of everything. I mean, I've also watched a lot of like Brian Greene and stuff too, so you have to kind of understand that's what I'm thinking about as well. He talks about like teleportation and like string theory and different dimensions and stuff like that. So anyway, I'm starting to think how I can understand those arguments that from some level of mysterious consciousness, the invisibility force, whatever it is, and then this like growth into this development, the sense of physicality where these certain portions that have more mass or whatever formulate together, and then we get this like experience that we walk through of the collection of our physical lives, but it's all like actually can be broken down and pieced apart. And so there's this strange interconnection of everything. I could see why when scientists and different ones go into this understanding, they then can merge into ideas of, say, like Buddhism or other things where you just kind of like break it down into like mindfulness and the mind and the consciousness and stuff. I can kind of see how you could take that leap and whatnot, like the interconnectedness of the wave of everything, What's also interesting, though, for going down this rabbit hole, though, is some of those studies where they talk about the wave, right? If you get kind of stuck in this like shared wave of consciousness and everything is like a wave, then it kind of gets into that question when they're studying waves, there's something that happens. And so this is what they call the observer theory or what have you. I'm really going down the rabbit hole here. Well, I'm just trying to explain where I'm coming from. You could probably look up all of these things. Maybe I'll make a file of all these videos so people can kind of follow down the rabbit hole what I'm like referencing. So, like I'm not just making this up. I mean, it sounds peculiar, but so like the observer then is this strange phenomenon that they, in studying waves and energy and patterns and wave patterns, they noticed that at some level, when they added another component to it, it seems to affect the pattern. And so they add this other component to this wave motion, and then it causes some level or seemingly of the behavior to collapse into other like more simplified, instead of like an expansive wave pattern. When they add this observer, because at first they just added the observer so that they could count and get closer to the counts of how they were affecting the waves. But what they found is that this other strange phenomenon, that when they added the observer to the wave motion that was expansive, it causes that it has an effect. Or seemingly, this, I haven't kept up on following all of this stuff, and so I don't know, maybe there's other ways that people are looking at these ideas, but I'm just explaining what's in the backdrop of my mind over all these years of studying these things. So what they're finding is this expansive wave pattern, when they add this other component of the observer, affects it just in its seemingly affects it just in its being there, and causes it to collapse into these other behaviors that seemingly behave in ways that cooperate with these other simplified patterns. And so then it just seemed like interesting, right? Why does it seem like adding this additional component to these interactions cause it to behave differently? So anyway, that's also in my mind when I'm thinking about stuff, is when you're thinking about this whole like wave of consciousness, and then this aspect of the observer or the introduction of another component causes it to behave in these other collapsed, simplified manners unto those interactions. There seems to be something peculiar going on there, right? In my religious thinking and looking at the story in scripture, it also causes me to think of like when it says, where two or more are gathered, God is in the midst, or whatever. And so it kind of makes me wonder, like, what comes into effect, what switches or seems to like influence the wave pattern when another component is introduced to it. Maybe there's like a physics thing going on there, what have you, but it just seemed interesting. So like I said, in my mind, thinking of like scripture and patterns and systems, I was like, oh, that's interesting. So because we were trying to understand how to get out of just the idea of this shared wave of consciousness and the experiences that we find where it seems to collapse into these other simplified behaviors in reference to other people or other component. And so I found that interesting. So these are the things I'm also considering when I'm looking at what are the physics or the basic components or the effects at the simplified version of our experience and how we're created, that we all kind of share at a basic level, and then from there expands out unto those developed relationships and the way that we interact with those relationships into these other complex systems. And what it also seems like, if then you're taking like a scriptural approach to it. So some of the things then, if we're looking at the religion atheist debate in terms of these systems and components, is okay, atheists will say, well, this is the point where we don't believe that there's a God in it, because eventually, or at least like not a good God, they'll say, if anything, humans or others eventually have to produce corrective measures on these, because it starts to expand so far out. Once it expands farther out, it creates, in some instances can create really harmful effects that have ripple effects that affect other interactions, and they're not always seeming to be in a standard of like optimal well-being, right? So that's at the point where atheists will say, we'd like to believe in a good God and creator and whatnot, but when we study creation, yes, there's some beautiful good things, but in the midst of it, there's also some horrific things. And how could a creator have allowed some of these really horrific things that we see even when we study the various types of survival systems that are evolved within creation. And so, for instance, there'll be examples as to like some creatures have to kind of like, for instance, like parasites and other things that kind of live and zap the life out of other creatures, and then like just some of the other survival tactics that influence certain animal behavior and human behavior and stuff like that. And so they'll say there just eventually seems to be the need for corrective measure, that evolution on its own, some things phase out and then some things flourish into, like natural selection, survival of the fittest, those types of things. So yes, there's beauty, but then there's also like the horrific things of natural selection and Darwinianism and stuff like that. Then that calls into question the creator God aspect, or what kind of creator God. So at that point, then the things that religion would have to account for in its interpretation is along these lines of studying evolutionary theory and these systems and whatnot, we can kind of see the argument for the development of something simple to some complex system, the effect of outside forces to inside forces and stuff like that. But what about when it gets to the point where at a more advanced level, things start to then create into some horrific survival scenarios? And then it seems to influence how other portions are created and other portions are created, and how is God a part of that, right? So as I was saying before, that's where some theologians kind of input the, like saying the demon in the, like the demon in the mix of things, the demon in the machine influences things to be destructive to the way things could otherwise evolve, or, things like that. There's other interpretations. I'm not saying that that's necessarily my interpretation. I'm just kind of introducing some of these ideas here. So anyway, what it seems like when you get to this point and just kind of imagining and following through, or at least my mind trying to think through some of this, what I start to imagine is that when you start really getting into understanding it, or looking at it this way, not saying I'm correct, just trying to say I'm introducing how I'm thinking about it with all these various components, right? Is that if you imagine a wave and everything is just one big wave, interconnected, inescapable wave, what starts to, or not wave, but maybe like blanket of existence or something, what starts to seem to develop other stages from there, like of shift, is that when something starts developing in a type of height, then, so for instance, on the Fibonacci sequence, you can see how something, so at the very base, starts from a minuscule point. From that point then creates another effect, and then that effect creates another effect, and then it develops this like complex expansion out, and also among that a height. It seems as though once something creates a height, then once there are different levels of height that are reached, it then seems to create a different effect, where then there seems to be influences where other portions of developed creation or creatures or what have you experience another stage of relationship where they're introduced to other experiences from a height to a height. That's why I drew that silly picture that kind of looks like those Dr. Seuss characters on like different heights, like expanded out. Once there's the relationship where then it creates from height to height, that's different than from a lower level of interrelational like mutuality that's developing upwards and outwards and interconnected. Because at that stage of development, it's all like this web of of like interplay, morphing it into this evolving. Once it's introduced from a height to another height, then that's a whole different like introduction or interaction that's not familiar with components all the way down, if that makes sense. And so then it seems that at that level, there can become miscommunication, difficulty in understanding how to be introduced to what are the mutual benefits or negotiation between entities. And so then that develops a different stage of relational introduction or experience. And so what it seems like at that level, you would assume would be of use and of benefit is that those different entities would produce an ability to communicate, some level of like communicating between entities. Otherwise, how do they like perceive better ways to be introduced to these like different entities? And so then it kind of gets into this question of confusion of that. So this is where I feel it's kind of strange trying to like go into this portion, but this is just a whole other supposing, right? What we find then is this is an example of what seems to happen at the heights of complex development among human systems and also animal systems and other ecosystems, right? That if you try to introduce one ecosystem, like other interactions of something into something that is not really their ecosystem, then they're not adapted to it. It's totally different. There's like a steep learning curve of acclimation or adapting. For instance, like people say, let's clone a mammoth or something. Let's clone a mammoth and put them in like, I don't know, New York City or something. And of course, that's like two different systems, very different heights of systems. And even though they're life and you could study them in isolation, they don't live in that, like a mammoth would have to be in its like natural habitat by which it's like developed from. And so then it seems like once you get these like systems introduced to other systems, and the ability, because of height reached, introduces them at different stages. Like I said, it seems like it would favor over time that they'd have the ability to share communication, lest it become miscommunication and then maybe improperly adapting, right? Anyway, so it's thinking about these as to how I started to imagine and think about systems and whatnot, and then the need for like communicating and understanding those, like what optimizes, at least to, the best that you could, those interactions. And then we find that as a similar thing within our human-grown systems. So anyway, I think I've kind of said enough here for now. It kind of introduces a little bit of how I'm thinking about it in the backdrop of certain mechanisms that influence outcomes and behaviors, and then the need for attempting to understand what we're communicating, and then looking at the idea of, like what are shared human values, and then what are certain behaviors and dynamics that have evolved out from certain conditions. How should those conditions and behaviors tend to shift as we increase in this like beneficial, like morphing system that serves people's needs and whatnot. So that's kind of what I was trying to introduce when I was suggesting I tend to think that human beings and shared human behavior and a similarity of survival needs and the similar imagery by which we function should also have similar outcomes of like spiritual needs. And as we increase those, then minimizing or relinquishing the need for the other indicators of and among survival that should be able to, like within religion, reach a stage of I guess what you call, like if you're looking at it from scriptural point of view, like completion or fulfillment in certain mechanisms of acclamation, practices and religious acclamation. I tend to look at a lot, so I guess this is clarifying too. I tend to look at a lot of like religious practices as intending to acclimate us into our more spiritual unifying understanding and alignment and whatnot. I guess I could kind of say this really quick. So that kind of like somewhat introduces the idea of some forms of conflict, and then how conflict can develop more conflict, and how there needs to be communication and understanding, and the understanding like a sense of mutuality or survivability to a more optimal benefit and whatnot. In relation to like other factors and environments and things like that. But then the question would be, okay, well, if we kind of account for that, then some of the question would be, why would God create us like that though? Why create us from these small portions with these certain like shared physics, and then develop over time these certain interactions? But I guess even along those lines, even if God just created us as like these like the final version of creation, and like animals and plant life and whatnot, and our human body and our function in the way that we that we see it now in the basic natural functions, even if even if it was the case, we would still, so it's hard for us to even conceive of imagining our existence without then understanding more about ourselves as we piece it all apart, kind of, and study and understand like the developed interactions between us and other forms of creation and whatnot. So I think maybe what we're thinking about when we're asking that is, why doesn't God control or give us the ability to fully understand our existence and whatnot? So then it kind of becomes the question of like, why don't we understand our existence in a better way so we can prevent and not like stumble into these miscommunications and other things along those lines. And I mean, it is an interesting thing to start considering it along those lines, like why? And then it gets into the whole philosophical, like, why are we even here? Why would we do this? And even if it was just all by chance, why would it develop into eventually basically, like, why is there something rather than nothing, right? Like that philosophers talk about. And then now that there is something, and we're perceiving ourselves, and we're developing into these systems, and we're realizing that there's a better way rather than like a hindrance that just like deconstructs us out of existence, and then we tend to want to exist for the most part, and then we start to optimize existence. Why? It does seem to make sense. And I think this is where, maybe a little bit of where Sam Harris's argument comes in, is like, well, some of the reason for wanting to optimize your existence is that if you're here, you might as well solve for a better version of why you're here. And what we find among solving for a better version of why we're here is that we should then select for, like, it's more likely of survivability if we don't have all of these battles to fight and obstacles and obstructions that hinder our ability. And then because we start to realize we're this interconnected form of existence, that it also is to our benefit to look at the mutuality of de-escalating social conditions so that we could diffuse perpetual survival, right? And then among that, we also find that there's like this energy dynamic where, in relation to this network of trying to optimize a better system of existence, we only have so much energy by which like we don't know maybe if we tap into a better unit, because maybe it's what it seems to suggest even in our own individual bodies as like our body, our individual like system that we find ourselves in, and then the grand system that we find ourselves in, we do find that stress and other things in survival mode inhibits our otherwise like more optimal like opening up of potential. And so another question that we're asking ourselves is, why are we living trapped in miscommunication and hostility that everything that we study seems to suggest that we should be functioning at a better, more cohesive unit of existence? And so then it's that question of like, what's happening there? And so in some weird roundabout way, that actually is what scripture is talking about. That's the story that some of scripture is making reference to, is why do we feel disconnected from an otherwise like more synchronized ability to understand how to go about our lives? Why does it feel kind of inhibited or blocked? Why do we have this like perception when we look at creation and ourselves that we need to kind of transform it and kind of reconcile some things and then shift toward a type of metamorphosis? So then a lot of the story is how to create a better system, how to prevent the like falling into hostility that then just like sets us off in decline unto death and diminishes our life. And then how do we connect more to this spiritual understanding, and how do we break out of what seems to be this inhibiting factor of weird dominions and whatnot from hostilities among each other? And so in some ways that's what the story seems to be making reference to, if you put it into like components of like studying life and whatnot, and then putting it into story form. But then there still are other factors to consider and whatnot. But anyway, I'll leave it at that. I don't know if this will just be something that I'll maybe do like a series on or something, because eventually then talking about systems. And I was setting this up though with the idea of then looking at this and comparing it to conundrums we find in questions about God in the scriptural story and what seems to be going on there. So anyway, and also cross-referencing it with other systems and other religious beliefs, and when they seem like these complex units that are different than ours, how do we have that communication to solve for the things that we have in common, and helping understand the behavioral dynamics that have developed from certain conditions, what could be expected as the purposes of life serve to merge people better and better together, and then shift and then properly relationally evolve like certain requirements that have been developed from survival. So like religious requirements and cultural requirements, and both honoring those connections of those agreements, but then being open to, if this is done correctly, then how do we keep refining it? And then also just looking at life and what's going on there. And so anyway, that's what I was, I think, trying to say, but I had come about it from a different route, where I realized, I need to unpack what I'm thinking about as I'm trying to communicate some of this stuff.